Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all of you who've taken the time to attend this webinar event today titled The Crisis of Antibiotic Resistance, Are We Entering the Post-Antibiotic Era? My name is Deb Smith, and I'm an improvement consultant and the lead for the VHQC Maryland, Virginia HAI Improvement Network. We call that the Move-In Network. VHQC is the Quality Innovation Network working to improve health care for Maryland and Virginia providers, stakeholders, and consumers. I have a few announcements to make before I turn the floor over today. An hour is hardly enough time to scratch the surface of this issue, so we'll be using the full hour for this presentation. We do, however, want to give everybody the opportunity to comment and ask questions, so please use the chat function at the right-hand side of your screen and ask your questions or make your comments during this presentation. These will all be compiled and answered and sent out with the recording in about a week. The recorded webinar will be available on the VHQC online community. There'll be a link for the community in the chat box and at the end of this presentation. The slide handouts for this webinar will be included at the same time as the recording and the questions. Our presenter today is Dr. Mike Stevens. Dr. Stevens has many roles and responsibilities at VCU Medical Center, including Assistant Professor of Medicine for the Division of Infectious Diseases, the Associate Hospital Epidemiologist, and the Director for the Antimicrobial Stewardship Program. Dr. Stevens is an advocate for infection prevention and antimicrobial stewardship, and he serves as a member of the Virginia HAI Advisory Group, working with other advisory group members on the antibiotic stewardship subgroup. He's a subject matter expert, and he's been an excellent resource for many other stakeholders. His work impacts all healthcare providers and consumers in the Commonwealth of Virginia and beyond. I'm honored today to turn the floor over to Dr. Stevens for this exciting and informative educational opportunity today. So, Dr. Stevens, the floor is yours.
Well, Deb, thank you for that kind introduction, and hello, everyone. We're going to talk about the problem of antibiotic resistance and touch on antibiotic stewardship. This is a mixed audience. This is almost a 1,000-foot view of the problem, and like Deb said, we really could talk for hours on end about this subject. I'm glad it's a mixed audience because really this sort of problem is going to take a mixed audience solution for sure. It's a problem that affects all of us, and we all will have a role to play in addressing it. I promise that we'll be done right at 11 as well. In the slide deck, there are a lot of reference slides, which I encourage you to look at later on when these are posted. So in the interest of time, I'll dive right in. So we'll move right past this and talk about the learning objectives. So we're going to talk about the problem of antibiotic resistance. We're going to talk about the antibiotic pipeline, or what new drugs are coming in the pipeline to address some of the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. We'll talk briefly about strategies to improve antibiotic use, as well as inpatient antibiotic stewardship. I'd like to start this talk with a case history. This is a real patient that I saw. Mr. S, a 65-year-old male with diabetes who had a fracture of his left foot on July 28th that was initially treated conservatively but ultimately required surgical intervention on September 4th, and he developed a post-op wound infection. And his wound culture grew Pseudomonas, which was essentially pan-resistant. They're resistant to all antibiotics save for colistin, which is an antibiotic that was essentially shelved in the 1970s secondary to newer, better agents, better tolerated agents coming out, colistin being associated with significant neuro and renal toxicity. And this is what he was discharged on. However, he developed neurotoxicity and renal insufficiency and was readmitted and underwent amputation of his leg below the knee. And unfortunately, this is an all-too-common scenario in 2016, but it harkens back to the descriptions of treating infectious diseases in the 19th century. This is Sir William Osler, who is believed to be the father of internal medicine, and he wrote the seminal textbook on internal medicine in 1892, and this is how he describes sepsis. the treatment of septicemia and pynemia, he's really referring to bacteremia, is largely a surgical problem. We, and he's referring to internists, have no remedy to brilliant and remarkable results which follow complete evacuation of the pus with thorough drainage to the indication for the only successful treatment of this condition. And essentially what he's saying is if you have something that's infected and you can cut it off or you can drain it or debride it, this really is the only way that you can manage these infections. And this sounds very similar to the case that I just presented. So you could say potentially we're entering a post-antibiotic era or returning to the pre-antibiotic era, and we'll talk more about this. But the problem in a nutshell is that antibiotic use selects for the emergence of resistant organisms, and the emergence of resistant organisms has outpaced the development of new antibiotics. That's the problem. Some of the specifics, the CDC estimates 2 million people acquire infections with antibiotic-resistant bacteria yearly, and 23,000 die as a direct result of these infections. Now, these numbers probably underestimate the true scope of the problem. The other thing is treating antibiotic resistance is very costly. It's estimated this is associated with $20 to $35 billion per year in excess costs in the U.S. alone, and that's in 2016. Recent report came out by Jim O'Neill and his group. This is really a Herculean effort looking at the problem of antibiotic resistance with recommendations for how we're going to deal with this problem. You can find this online, this entire report, and it's worth looking at. The final report being published in May 2016. It's estimated by 2050, if we maintain our current trajectory with antibiotic resistance, that 10 million people per year will be dying from antibiotic-resistant infections. That's more than are projected to die from cancer in 2050, as well as costing $100 trillion globally per year. And roughly what this equates to in terms of mortality is a person dying from an antibiotic-resistant infection every 3 seconds. And this is not alarmist. They make a truly rational argument for why this is going to occur. So we're definitely at a critical juncture in terms of addressing this issue. The other important thing to note is that for infections that lead to sepsis and shock, antibiotics are chosen empirically. We do not know what the infecting organism is at time zero, and in fact probably will not find this out for 48 to 72 hours as we wait for cultures to come back. So it is critical that we cover the infecting pathogen at time zero, and again, the antibiotics are chosen empirically. As we see more resistance in organisms, we are going to fail with this initial coverage more and more. And that's an important concept when we're talking about why it matters that we're seeing so much resistance. The other thing is, really, we had the widespread deployment of antibiotics since the 1940s. It's been less than 100 years since we saw the widespread deployment of antibiotics. The antibiotics have permitted many of the advances in modern medicine. So, for instance, without antibiotics, you're going to have limited cancer treatments because patients can't survive the infectious complications that come with chemotherapy. We will have no complex surgeries because the antibiotics we use for prophylaxis may not be available. So these are things like complicated heart surgeries, orthopedic surgeries, central nervous system surgeries, also transplantation. Inevitably, patients develop infections, as well as we have to use antibiotics to prevent infections. So things like bone marrow transplants and solid organ transplants would be impossible without antibiotics. We also have limited options for rheumatologic diseases and renal replacement therapy, as these folks in rheumatologic diseases are immune compromised, and then renal replacement therapy, oftentimes people get bloodstream infections, and we need antibiotics to treat these things. So more resistance and limitations in our antibiotic armamentarium will compromise all of these things. And how does resistance happen? So essentially, you have a lot of germs, you have a population of bacteria, you expose those bacteria to an antibiotic, and you select out for the ones that were resistant to the antibiotic. That subpopulation reproduces, and that's what's left behind. Or you can also have populations of bacteria share their resistance determinants or elements with each other. Now, these are ways that you can develop resistance. So this is another way to look at it. You have susceptible bacteria that acquire mutations and become resistant. You can have susceptible bacteria, near-resistant bacteria, and they can share this little green circle thing is a plasmid, and they can share that genetic resistance determinant and become resistant themselves. Now, there has been a lot of stuff in the news recently about the MCR1 positive E. coli that was found in the urine of a patient as well as in some animals. Now, the concern there is that MCR1 gene that confers colistin resistance actually can be spread via plasmids to more resistant bacteria, thereby limiting the effectiveness of our empiric antibiotics in the setting of things like sepsis and shock. And that's the concern. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but it's important to sort of touch base on the pathophys. Now, again, this is referring to the recent reports of that MCR1 positive patient and then the animals. Again, this is the concern. We're developing true superbugs, which will be pan-resistant to antibiotics. This is not hyperbole. This is reality. And why does this occur? Well, it's a matter of evolution to some extent. I like this graphic because I think it really gives you a sense of the amazing teleologic or evolutionary advantage that organisms have over human beings. So in yellow here, you see the human population curve going from an estimated 1 person to 5 billion. This took us roughly 3.5 billion years, and you can imagine the amazing evolutionary changes in human beings over this time period. Well, bacteria can do this in 12 hours under optimal conditions. A single bacterial cell going to 5 billion cells in 12 hours. Imagine how much these bacteria can change under the selective pressure of antibiotics even in a very short time period. And we see resistance emerge very rapidly whenever we deploy what we call a quote-unquote novel antibiotic. And why is this? Well, this is getting back to the concept that the resistome, the antibiotic resistome, is ancient and widespread. This study actually looked at a sample of bacteria from a cave in New Mexico that had been walled off or isolated from human beings for 4 million years. And they found widespread antibiotic resistance, including to the drug daptomycin, which was FDA approved in 2004. And you say, well, how could that be? Well, this is because almost all of our antibiotics were adopted from nature. So you go back to those original descriptions of the accident which allowed Fleming to discover penicillin. Well, we sift through soil or we sift through other natural materials to find antibiotic compounds that organisms have been using against each other to get a selective advantage in their own ecologic niche for millennia, for thousands of years to millions of years. And organisms have already figured out how to overcome these compounds. We adopt them from nature, we call them new, but they're not truly new, so it's not surprising that we see widespread resistance develop when we deploy these quote-unquote novel antibiotics. So how does this happen? Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this somewhat superficially, but this is a graphic from the CDC, and unfortunately they labeled this gentleman George. And George has lots of issues, and he's going to spread and develop resistance. So if he can get antibiotics, he develops resistant bacteria in his gut. And when we develop infections, oftentimes we develop infections with our normal flora, those bacteria that live on and in us. Normally, if they become antibiotic resistant and we develop an infection, it's with those organisms. Now, George can be at home or in the community. He'll spread the resistant bacteria. Maybe he doesn't wash his hands after he uses the bathroom and touches surfaces. Other people touch those surfaces. Maybe he's a cook and he prepares your food. There's lots of ways this can happen. Or he can get care at a hospital or other healthcare facility and spread things from direct contact with others or through indirect contact with environmental surfaces or via the hands of healthcare workers. So this is definitely a pitch for wash your hands before and after you touch patients because a lot of the resistant bacteria that are spread are actually spread on the hands of healthcare workers. So he is now spraying things in lots of different ways. And then on the surface of the healthcare facility, patients can pick those up and then take them back to the community. And now George has a big posse of friends in the middle here who all have resistant bacteria. Other ways this can happen, animals get antibiotics and develop the resistant bacteria in their guts, and then we handle the meat or other products from these animals, and then we inoculate ourselves and change our own gut flora, and we can develop resistance that way. Or the fertilizer or runoff from these areas where the animals are being raised can get on food crops, and then we can touch or eat those food crops, and then we also can become colonized that way. So there's lots of ways this can happen, and really when we're talking about solutions, they have to be these One Health solutions that address antibiotic use, not just in human medicine, but also in animal populations. This tells you roughly the percentage of antibiotics that are used for therapeutic human use versus animal use. And it's only 14% of antibiotics being used for therapeutic human use. Over 70% are for non-therapeutic use in animals. And you say, well, why would we do that? Well, we do that because it grows big, fat animals. And we'll show some stuff on that here in a second. The one thing this slide is getting to, it's a little busy, but the point here is 31 of the 41 antibiotics that are FDA approved for use in animals actually impact the antibiotics used in humans directly. They are similar in structure and will compromise the antibiotics that we use that are medically important for humans. So this definitely impacts human medicine, having animals that are receiving antibiotics. This gives you a sense of why people use antibiotics to grow animals. Essentially what this study did, this is from the journal Poultry Science, which is not one I look at weekly, but was pretty powerful in terms of showing why people are doing this. They looked at the relative sizes of commercial chickens at different days, and this is at day 56. You can see in 1957 they were 905 grams. In 2005, this day 56, same day, they were over 4,000 grams, and that's over 4 times larger. And what people found almost incidentally was when they were exposed to antibiotics, you got the production of bigger, fatter animals. Interestingly enough, in getting to the concept that antibiotics are not necessarily benign, there is some compelling preliminary data that suggests some of the obesity epidemic in children may be related to the antibiotic use. Now, obviously, more needs to be done in terms of direct attribution here, but it is compelling in terms of hypothesis generation. Maybe we're having some collateral damage from antibiotics that we didn't anticipate. This is the prevalence of overweight children and adolescents in the blue and purple bars, respectively, by time period in the U.S. You can see back in 1963 to 1970, only 4 to 5% across these two groups were actually overweight. And you flash forward to 1999 to 2002, 16% of the two groups are overweight. So clearly something's going on here. It's probably multifactorial, but it's definitely worth considering. And it gets to the human microbiome. So we're 10 parts bacteria to 1 part human cell. There are 10 bacteria cells for every 1 human cell in the body, in and around the body. And we don't understand the human microbiome very well. A lot of research is going into this. Perhaps in 20, 30 years we'll look back and really, be surprised by what we find. But we know that when we use antibiotics, we alter that microbiome, and that's going to potentially have collateral damage. There, again, is preliminary research that this altered microbiome may contribute to things like allergies, again, obesity, even behavior changes. So there's probably collateral damage from antibiotics that extends beyond things like drug reactions and Clostridium difficile. And all this needs to be sorted out. To get to the concept that antibiotics are not benign, and the sort of favorite thing that people say is, well, you wouldn't want a non-oncologist prescribing your chemotherapeutic agents. Antibiotics potentially could be looked at in the same way. Pretty much any physician can prescribe antibiotics, but they're not necessarily benign compounds. 1 out of 5 every ER visits for an adverse drug event is related to antibiotics. And it's the most common cause of emergency department visits for adverse drug events in children under the age of 18 years of age. And we know antibiotics are overused. So that study came out recently implying maybe 30% antibiotics are overused really across the different studies It can be up to 50% or even higher, and there are regional differences in overuse as well. Clearly, antibiotics are not used in a standardized fashion or in an optimal fashion, even the majority of the time. They're given when they're not needed. They're continued when they're not necessary. They're given at the wrong dose. Broad-spectrum agents are used to treat very susceptible bacteria, and sometimes the wrong antibiotic is given to treat an infection. We'll talk more about why this is. Certainly, I don't think clinicians are going out and purposefully misusing antibiotics. I think there's a paucity of data to help guide the management of many infectious conditions, and some of the things that will help curb the antibiotic resistance crisis will be improved diagnostics and studies that help actually develop clinical guidelines that will help people use antibiotics more optimally. We'll touch base on that briefly. Getting an antibiotic increases a patient's chance of becoming colonized or infected with a resistant organism. This is a patient with a spinal cord injury who developed serial urinary tract infection with a Pseudomonas. And you can see here in green, these are susceptible. This organism is susceptible to these agents in the left-hand column. The R is resistant. So green is good, red is bad. And you can see, again, people oftentimes will develop infections with their endogenous flora, their own flora, and this is what was happening to this gentleman, to the point where he became his organism became almost pan-resistant over this time course. Now, the scary thing here is if this gentleman's in a room with somebody else and the healthcare worker, doesn't wash their hands from caring for him to the other person in the room or someone else on the ward, they don't have to wait this prolonged period of time to develop resistance. Resistance can be developed much faster than this, but you can spread this almost pan-resistant organism to another patient, and then they can subsequently develop an infection with this pan-resistant organism. So this is a major concern. So drug resistance cuts across really all types of antimicrobials, and we're really focusing on bacteria, but this extends to things like gonorrhea, which is bacteria, but there is a nearly pan-resistant gonorrhea that is circulating now. Things like MRSA as well. Again, I'm focusing on gram-negatives in this talk, but MRSA as well is something that we have to consider. We're going to talk more about the gram-negatives. We also have to think about antimalarials, antifungals, tuberculosis drugs. It cuts across all compounds. Now, when we talk about antibiotics, we're in what's called a discovery void. And this is the problem with us outpacing the development of new antibiotics. So as we saw more and more drug resistance, it wasn't a major issue because we saw the deployment or the discovery of new antibiotics rapidly. But we're in a huge discovery void with a lot less investment and discovery of new antimicrobial compounds. You can see this looks at declining antibiotic approvals over time. Clearly you can see that they're falling off, and we'll speak to why this is happening. When we talk about the antibiotic pipeline, or things that are working their way through the approval process, in light blue here, this refers to agents that may have some activity against those really nasty, nearly pan-resistant gram-negatives, and that's what we need. We don't need another fluoroquinolone. We don't need another antibiotics in the same classes of antibiotics we have. We need something with a truly novel mechanism of action to help these patients like the one I mentioned in the case at the beginning of the talk. That's what we need. And right now, there's one antibiotic sort of working its way through the pipeline which may have activity against these nasty gram-negatives, but the majority really are not ones that will be super helpful to curb the problem or to treat these folks with resistant organisms. The antibiotic pipeline, in terms of getting antibiotics through the pipeline, this has improved, and I'll talk about this in a slide or two, in recent years. Before the FDA approval process, from entering the pipeline, you would expect a 10 to 15-year process before you'd see that as something that you could use on a patient. So things have improved, but they carry their own challenges. So why don't we see new antibiotics being developed? It's scientifically difficult. There's regulatory uncertainty. So the rules change. It's a difficult market because they're only used for a brief period of time, and we restrict their use. So immediately, someone like me comes along and says, we can't use it, you can't have it because we don't want to lose it. And that really sort of violates the free market in terms of incentives to develop these antibiotics. So we've seen widespread industry abandonment and industrial consolidation. There's fewer pharmaceutical companies, and they are abandoning antibiotic development. You can look at the amount of money that was actually put into R&D for new drugs in between 2003 and 2013, $38 billion in investment with only $1.8 billion invested in new antibiotics. So clearly there's a market failure here. This really looks at what's put in by pharmaceutical companies in terms of investment to develop a new antibiotic. Now, just because they invest in an antibiotic doesn't mean it's something that can actually be used in people. Now, if it can, it takes quite a long time to recoup sort of the losses and start making money. Again, it's more compelling to put money into lifestyle drugs like Viagra or Cialis, or even proton pump inhibitors or cardiovascular drugs that have to be taken lifelong than something that's going to be restricted immediately and used for a brief period of time. In 2012, there was a reboot of the FDA approval system for antibiotics, the GAIN Act, and this was a shift from a traditional model with two very expensive, large phase 3 clinical trials to trials utilizing less clinical data and employing more pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic data. And what this means is there's less sort of safety data for these new drugs coming to market. Sapazidine and avibactam was brought to market on phase 2 trial data. With data from only 338 patients from 2 randomized clinical trials, and it's on a restricted label because of this. Now, the thing that many clinicians probably don't understand is that it's on a restricted label that they're using an antibiotic that was only tested in 338 patients, and really they're relying on post-marketing surveillance to determine the sort of key issues that would have normally been determined in those phase 3 clinical trials. So there, to some extent, there is more uncertainty, there's more unknown with these agents, and that's something I think clinicians really have to understand, and we have to use these appropriately and really watch for and share when we see sort of bizarre things come up when these have been deployed. So again, going back to the concept, we've seen the widespread deployment of antibiotics for less than 100 years. And we're already at a point with these nasty resistant gram-negatives where we've entered a post-antibiotic era or return to that pre-antibiotic era. So something has to happen, or this is only going to get worse. Major issues. So there are many issues, and again, we could talk about this for hours. I'm going to touch base on some of the key ones. Surveillance is poor. So all these news reports about that MCR1 determined in the E. coli, we know about that because somebody looked for it. Now, we don't have universal surveillance nationally or globally, and this is a major issue in terms of knowing the scope of the problem and trying to prevent it. Even if we could detect it, even if the threat is detected, our ability to respond to it is poor. This is a slide from the WHO that gives you a sense of, which country has some surveillance data. Green would be, as good as it gets. And you can see we're green here in the U.S., but I would argue our surveillance isn't particularly good. And in some areas of the world where infection control is worse and antibiotics are probably overused more than in some other countries, surveillance really is quite poor. And this is where we're seeing the emergence of some of these really nasty pathogens, which can spread globally very rapidly. So this truly is a global issue, and surveillance is going to be a key way is going to be a key feature of trying to address this issue. This is somebody doing the modified Hodge test to look for carbapenemase production. It's a very labor-intensive test. When you think about doing point prevalence surveys for things like carbapenem-resistant Enterobacter ACA, it's not feasible for many hospitals. Some molecular tests have been developed and are seeing wider deployment. Clearly, we need new strategies, though, and universal or global strategies, really coordinated strategies to address the problem of surveillance. Other issue, data on antibiotic use in animal and in humans are not systematically collected or mandated, really, and we don't really know what to do with antibiotics. So this is changing with the CDC's antibiotic, the CDC's AUR module to some extent, but we don't really know what the most meaningful antibiotic use data are. So there is a standard, which is days of therapy per 1,000 patient days, but there is no easy way to compare institutions in a risk-adjusted fashion to know what it means when you get those data back. So that's what a direct clinician wants to know. They don't want to necessarily know how much carbapenems they're using. They want to know if that's appropriate or not, and what are other units in other hospitals that are similar to us, what are they doing? And the CDC has done a lot of work with this and is now producing an SAR, sort of like a SIR for healthcare-associated infections. So we're getting closer to meaningful sort of antibiotic use, but we need risk-adjusted models. We need to sort of know what to do with those data when we get them. Other issues, so programs to improve antibiotic use are not widely deployed in the U.S., and this is going to change in the near future with the sort of de facto CMS mandates that appear to be on the horizon, or really are here. The other big thing is, back in 2010, there weren't a lot of people talking about antibiotic resistance, at least popularly or in the media. That has completely changed. I think you really can't look at the news now and not find something about antibiotic resistance. And that's good. And people have been very thoughtful about this problem, and a lot's come out trying to address this issue. And including this report from the White House in September 2014 outlining a strategy to deal with this issue, this incredible review on antimicrobial resistance that I talked about earlier, which I really strongly recommend that you go and you read front to back. It's compelling and really, I think, outlines well what we need to do as a society globally to tackle this problem. And then a playbook came out, which is terrific. This really, for stewardship, for the different strategies, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution for every healthcare institution because the needs and resources will be different. This allows you to choose high-yield strategies sort of a la carte that you can tailor to your institution. So I highly recommend you take a look at this as well. It's been, being involved in stewardship the last 3 months, it's been kind of like being a kid in a candy shop with all the new sort of amazing things that have been coming out. So I used to show this slide when I did versions of this talk. Will inpatient stewardship be mandated? There'd be several points on the slide. I just left it blank because it looks like, yes, it will be with the CMS stuff that has come out in the last 2 weeks for comment. The reference here is at the bottom. If you haven't seen this, this is a proposed rule change which would be tied to Medicare, Medicaid funding, which essentially says as a condition of participation, you need a stewardship program. So it's worth exploring this, at least superficially. These are the things they put out there, these 3 things. So let's look at them in a little more detail. So they say you need an active and a hospital-wide stewardship program. And interestingly enough, they tied it to infection control. Now, infection control, we utilize a lot of the same, utilize a lot of the same techniques, ways of describing issues, and a lot of the same tools as antibiotic stewardship, and integration to a large extent makes sense. Also, the fact that they're likely in many hospitals, every hospital likely already has an infection control program, and so piggybacking on those resources makes sense to an extent. But this is the verbiage that's been put out there for comment. In the active and hospital-wide, the implication of this seems to be it has to cut across all services, and it needs to be more than sort of passive. It needs to deploy active strategies. The other thing which is quite interesting here is they said you need to designate an individual who's qualified through education, training, or experience in infectious diseases and/or antibiotic stewardship as the lead of the team. And I think this is as close as you can get to saying, really you need pharmacy leadership on the team, but also physician leadership, and they're almost saying you need an ID-trained physician, which has some challenges. Obviously, I'm biased. I think this is a great idea, but we need a bigger sort of ID workforce, I think, to make this work. That's just my 2 cents, but I'll show you something here in a second. This is data from the AMA looking at active physicians in the U.S. In 2010, we had 5,007 active U.S. ID physicians. 35% were greater than 55 years of age. And 35% were greater than 55 years of age. So you have an older, you have a workforce that has a significant number of older folks, and you only have 5,000 active physicians. The other thing is 51% of ID training programs did not fill last year. So you have less people coming into the workforce. And this is a problem. You only had 240 applicants across the entire U.S. for ID fellowship slots. When we look at the number of acute care hospitals in the U.S., there are something like 5,600 of them. That's 0.8 active ID physicians to hospitals. Obviously, there's a resource gap there. With older physicians that may be sort of working their way out of the field at some point, and you have fewer going into infectious disease. This actually was addressed in this review on antimicrobial resistance, the O'Neill report that I've alluded to several times here. And one of the things they note is a market failure for recruiting new physicians into infectious disease. It's hard to really feel sorry for these folks that are getting paid $170,000 a year, but it's the lowest amount of all the specialties that were looked at in this one analysis. And then you have folks with significant medical school debt. When they're looking at potential career choices, they're oftentimes choosing other things. One of those things being work as a hospitalist. So a medicine resident straight out of residency can make $250,000. To become an ID doctor, you have to train for another 2 to 3 years, which can be grueling at a fellow's pay, and make $170,000. So it's almost like a market failure here as well. So we have a market failure for the development of new antibiotics and also the training of new infectious disease physicians. I won't go through this in any great more detail, but I do think it's something we need to consider because one of the key challenges is we have, again, a paucity of great data to delineate the optimal management of infectious diseases. And you could say somebody who has an interest in infectious diseases could lead one of these teams. It's hard to protocolize ID because so much of what we do is anecdotal. This study looked at the level of evidence behind Infectious Disease Society of America practice guidelines. 41 guidelines, over 4,200 recommendations. And so these are the recommendations the premier ID society in the U.S. are putting out to manage conditions. You look at the quality of the evidence. Level 1 data is the gold standard randomized clinical trials. And 3 is essentially folks sitting around a table. It's anecdotal, saying, in my practice, I did this and it seemed to work. It's that level of data. And you can see only 14% of the recommendations were high quality. Over 55% were anecdotal. And this is why anybody involved in direct stewardship who has worked with ID practice with multiple physicians sees that it's so confusing to watch a different group of ID docs approach the same problem because largely it's anecdotal in terms of how you manage the problem because of that paucity of good evidence to delineate optimal management of many infectious conditions. And this is why it's difficult to protocolize a lot of ID, which is something that I think should make us call for better studies to get better data so that it's easier for folks to do the right thing. This harkens back to also, well, why do we see 50% antibiotic misuse? Well, this is because of that paucity of great data to delineate optimal management. If over 55% of recommendations are essentially anecdotal, it's very confusing for frontline clinicians with less ID experience to do the right thing in every scenario. And we'll move forward. Now, this is really difficult to see, but it gets back to some of the science used in infectious diseases. So this is taken from that report, 1940s to now. In diabetes, we had urine glucose in the 40s, and now we have personalized blood glucose monitors. And cardiac imaging in the 40s was a stethoscope, and now we have cardiac MRI. And then, at least in terms of approach to bacterial workup, the workup and management of bacterial pathogens, we had culture-based techniques to determine what the infecting pathogen is. And although advances have been made, largely the way that we work these things up hasn't changed in the last 100 years. We need better diagnostics. And you can imagine what these diagnostics would do for us. So you have a sick patient, you have a physician. Right now, it's empiric. You say, well, they've got this condition, these are the pathogens that are probably there. I'm going to give them this antibiotic and wait for cultures to come back. Well, if you had a rapid diagnostic test, and we have some of these deployed now, and we need more of them, you can rapidly say your upper respiratory infection is secondary to a human metapneumovirus or parainfluenza 4 or whatever, and you avoid antibiotics that way. We need more and better and easier to access rapid diagnostic testing. And then going back to these proposed CMS conditions of participation, the other thing is it's mentioned that we don't fully know what surveyors are going to be looking for as meeting the requirements of having a stewardship program. This will be sorted out sort of on the other end of things to some large extent, although some test questions, were already being utilized by surveyors. So we don't quite know what this means, but as early as January, we could see these deployed by folks that are surveying. So yes, it will be mandated, or de facto mandated. The CDC has some great materials looking at what do we do for the problem of antibiotic resistance. Preventive actions, we need surveillance, stewardship, and then develop new drugs and diagnostic tests. I'm going to touch base on stewardship in a very superficial fashion here. Again, I'll refer you to some materials here where you can find more about this. A new IDSA guideline was put out just recently, looking at key features of an antimicrobial stewardship program, updating the last guideline that was put out in 2007. This is excellent. I encourage you to look at it. But essentially, what stewardship is designed to do is to optimize clinical outcomes while minimizing unintended consequences of antibiotic use, including toxicity and the emergence of resistant organisms. Another way, just to put this, it aims to decrease the emergence of resistance and reduce harm from suboptimal antibiotic use. So this can be things like you have somebody with yeast in their blood, not on the antifungal, you detect that, you get them on something. So it's not all eliminating use or de-escalating antibiotics. It's improving the use of antibiotics. These are the key strategies. So formulary restriction, which essentially is people have to call for the use of certain antibiotic agents, and then, which is more labor-intensive, post-antibiotic review with provider feedback, and this can range from generating a line list of certain antibiotics to look at these patients and reach out to providers who have these patients on these antibiotics, a simple line list, to really complicated, nuanced line list that targets certain units or certain combinations of antibiotics or antibiotic use after X amount of time without positive cultures. It just depends on the resources you have to generate these opportunities for improvement. I'm not going to go through this in great detail. You can look at many things in many different ways. Again, I'll refer you to the guidelines, which can go through this in more detail. And you can have this as a passive or active process. So, for instance, at VCU, we generate probably 60 to 80 very nuanced opportunities to improve antibiotic use, which we directly reach out to providers or pharmacists on provider teams daily to de-escalate or improve antibiotic use. And there's different ways people do this. Again, it's going to depend. The best strategy depends on your resources and organizational needs. And really, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, which is why that National Quality Forum, the National Quality Forum playbook, I think, is so valuable and is worth looking at. There are many other strategies. Those two I mentioned are the key strategies. There's many supplemental strategies which are important and involve things like provider education or clinical treatment algorithms or de-escalation protocols, different protocols. For instance, we have a local treatment guidebook we've deployed at VCU, which deploys perhaps 27 separate different clinical guidelines for different conditions, which takes into account our local drug resistance, our formulary, and expert opinion. So these things can be very useful, but these, again, are the two key strategies. And you can find more in the guidelines. So what can somebody on the front line do? Now, we're talking to a mixed audience, and so many of the things that we can do really depend on our role, but we all have a role to play, and we're all going to be important to the solution. I think that's very important that we know that. But the first thing, the most important thing, is that we're aware that this problem exists. I had a wonderful clinician who's a friend call me yesterday from the outpatient clinic who practices general medicine with a ESBL positive E. coli urinary tract infection in a patient, and was somewhat surprised that this patient had developed this in somebody who didn't have a lot of healthcare exposure, didn't have a lot of antibiotic exposure, but like we saw the unfortunate picture of George from that CDC graphic, she may have picked it up from, meat from the grocery store. Maybe she had it on corn from, that was saved in the fecal matter from, runoff from one of these plants. It's hard to know, but this stuff is widespread, and we all just need to know just how sort of dire things are. I think once we know that, people will be motivated more to be part of the solution, especially in the general public. And that's one of those things of the O'Neill report that's advocated for, a massive public educational campaign talking about antibiotics. People likely, if they realize some of the collateral damage from antibiotics or just how dire the situation is, they would be less compelled to really argue for an antibiotic for something like an upper respiratory infection, that sort of stuff. We need to be aware of the problem. Additionally, when we're on the front line, we need to get cultures and deploy rapid diagnostics really at time zero, and then we need to get antibiotics in people appropriately. We need, on the front line, when we're ordering antibiotics, to record the indication, dose, expected duration in the patient record, and then reassess antibiotic use. So this is critical. It should be something we do daily. It's certainly at 48 hours. Do we need the antibiotics? What are we treating? Have we gotten cultures back? And then de-escalate as rapidly or narrow therapy as rapidly as we possibly can. And then we want to partner with the stewardship programs that we have or that we will develop rapidly in response to the de facto CMS mandate when we see there's areas to improve antibiotic use. And we've seen this many times at VCU where people will bring to us, hey, this is useful, but we need a protocol for this. For instance, how can we not use IV antibiotics in the setting of urinary tract infection? And we developed with frontline providers a protocol to address that issue. And so really there needs to be an ongoing dialogue between providers. The stewardship program should be a partner with an advocate for the frontline providers as they work hard to use antibiotics optimally. So I'm going to summarize here. Really, for some patients, we have entered the post-antibiotic era. No doubt about it. The one in the case that I had mentioned, not infrequently patients with these really multi-drug resistant, almost pan-resistant gram-negative infections are seen, and it harkens back to the descriptions of managing infectious diseases in the pre-antibiotic era. Antibiotic stewardship is a key component of preserving the drugs we have and preventing the emergence of resistance to new agents. It's one of the key strategies for addressing this issue, but not the only one. And I refer you to the O'Neill report to look at some of the other key things that need to happen to combat antibiotic resistance. And key challenges and opportunities exist. I think the de facto CMS mandate that's coming is fantastic, and I think a lot of people have steered some of the verbiage that actually was presented in the things that are out for comment from CMS in terms of having leadership and having a comprehensive and active stewardship program. All these things I think ultimately will be good in terms of dealing with this problem. The next step, though, really is, will we get the resources deployed to have high-end stewardship? Will we have the right people available to do the high-end stewardship that we want to see done? One thing for sure is true. If we fail to act now, it's going to have profound global health and economic consequences. So again, the projection is by 2050, you're seeing 10 million deaths a year from antibiotic resistance, more than the 8.2 million deaths that are projected from cancer in 2050, massive economic loss, one person dying every 3 seconds from an antibiotic-resistant infection. And really, in our concept of medicine or modern medicine, this is almost unfathomable in 2016, but will happen if we don't act now. And to end, again, I'll turn back to this 19th century description of managing infections. For many of our patients, they've returned to 19th century medicine, and unless we want to see more and more return to this, we need to act now. And I'll stop there, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Stevens. This is Deb Smith again. Extremely informative, interesting, and frankly just a little bit scary when we start thinking about some of this. We have a few questions in the chat box that I think I'm going to ask just one question. Dr. Stevens, if you don't mind, I'm just trying to get up to it.
Sure.
Oh, well, I can't find it right now. I'm sorry, everyone. Okay, here it is. So this is from Carrie Gordon, and the question is, what does the data suggest in regards to patients being exposed to broad-spectrum antibiotics for a few days and then abruptly removed? Theoretically, we've basically exposed the bacteria to these agents to develop resistance. Does that really play a role in emerging resistance patterns?
Well, it's a great question, and the answer surely is yes. For sure. You saw that chart looking at the evolution, human beings compared to bacteria in 12 hours, you can go from 1 to, 5 billion bacterial cells. What would 2 to 3 days of broad-spectrum antibiotics do to someone's normal flora? Again, we're 10 parts bacteria to 1 part human being. But, really, antibiotics are miraculous. There's no other adjective to place on antibiotics. In the right setting, antibiotics are completely life-saving. So if you have somebody come in in septic shock, if you don't give them antibiotics at time 0, again, they're given empirically, if you don't cover the infecting pathogen at time 0, that's associated with high mortality and significant morbidity. So really, the most important thing is managing that risk-benefit. If you have that patient, you work them up, you do the right testing, and then you de-escalate very rapidly. That's the key. The key is not to, just because they improve, leave them on that same broad-spectrum regimen. You de-escalate to something that is as narrow as possible, or you take the antibiotics off if you determine, they're not having a role in treating whatever condition the patient has. Maybe they had heart failure, maybe they had a viral infection, that sort of thing. The de-escalation is critical. But yeah, there may be collateral damage from the antibiotics, no doubt about it.
Thank you. And kind of in keeping right with that, it says, this is from Margaret Rowe to all patients or all participants, why is IV to PO switch an important part of stewardship?
Yeah, so that's a great question as well. Oftentimes that's referred to as like low-hanging fruit, in terms of stewardship, but it's super important. It's referred to that way because it's sort of an easier thing to protocolize. But it's important. Not only the cost thing between IV to PO, which ironically sometimes your cost goes up when you switch to PO. I won't go into that in any detail. But you're avoiding, IV access. Which decreases the risk that you could develop a bloodstream infection from manipulating an IV or developing thrombophlebitis or or other things like that. And again, it gets to the concept that you've reassessed that patient and you have de-escalated. That's an opportunity to de-escalate as well. Obviously, we're talking about oftentimes a one-to-one, same agent, IV to PO switch. But as well, that's an opportunity to reassess your antibiotic therapy and de-escalate to something that's less broad spectrum.
Thank you. We don't really have any time for any other questions, but they're great answers. And I did want to let everybody know that the polling survey is up, and there is a place to actually type in questions. We'll get those to Dr. Stevens also, so if you think of any questions now that you want to put in the polling. And Dr. Stevens you are okay with us sharing your email address, Dr. Stevens, for questions?
Yes, please. There it is.
All right, so everybody please write that down for your questions, and he will answer your questions when they get to him. I want to thank everybody for your time and participation today, and another heartfelt thank you to Dr. Stevens. This is an extremely timely presentation. It was very interesting, so thank you so much. Please remember to fill out that survey as you leave, and everyone have a great day. Thank you.